Before we descend into the shadows of the Zagros Mountains and the high-stakes game of deception that reshaped the Middle East, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden chapters of history and the operations that governments deny, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We are exposing the machinery of power that operates in the dark, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The year was 1965, and the Middle East was a powder keg waiting for a spark. In Tel Aviv, the lights in the intelligence headquarters burned late into the night. A coded message had arrived, not from a capital city or a diplomat, but from the rugged snow-capped peaks of northern Iraq. It was a plea for help from the Kurds, a stateless people fighting a desperate insurgency against the Iraqi government in Baghdad. To the uninitiated, this request might have seemed impossible to fulfill. Israel was surrounded by hostile Arab states. How could it possibly supply and support a rebellion deep inside enemy territory? But for the strategists of the Mossad, this wasn't just a request for aid. It was the opening move of the periphery strategy, a doctrine championed by David Ben-Gurion. The logic was cold, precise, and brilliant. If Israel could not make peace with its immediate neighbors, it would forge alliances with the non-Arab nations and peoples that surrounded them: Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, and the Kurds. The objective was simple. Every Iraqi division tied down fighting Kurds in the northern mountains was a division that could not stand on the Golan Heights or the Sinai to threaten Israel. But this operation, which would come to be known in the classified files as Operation Aryan, was about to evolve into something far more complex than just a supply line for rifles and medical kits. It would become the perfect cover for one of the deepest infiltrations in intelligence history. Eitan, a veteran operative of the Mossad, stood on an airstrip in Iran, the wind whipping dust against his face. He was not traveling as an Israeli. His passport was a masterpiece of forgery, a document that had taken the technical department months to perfect, much like the 27 false identities used by operatives years later in other theaters. He was about to cross into a world that existed off the maps, a place where the borders drawn by colonial powers in 1923 meant nothing to the people living there. The plan required elaborate deception. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had agreed to facilitate this covert alliance, seeing the benefit in weakening his rival in Baghdad. However, the Shah played a double game, suppressing his own Kurdish population while supporting the rebellion next door. Eitan knew that he was entering a hall of mirrors. He boarded a truck marked as commercial cargo, buried among crates of supplies that had changed hands multiple times to obscure their origin. As the convoy wound its way up the treacherous mountain passes, Eitan watched the landscape change. These mountains were natural fortresses, where narrow passes and high peaks favored the defender. It was here, in this rugged terrain, that he would meet the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighters whose name literally meant those who face death. But Eitan's mission went beyond training guerrillas. He was the vanguard. His goal was to establish a platform, a safe harbor in the mountains, from which the Mossad could launch an audacious intelligence penetration into the heart of Baghdad itself. He carried with him the tools of his trade: communication equipment capable of encrypted bursts, large amounts of currency for bribery, and the psychological readiness to live a lie for as long as it took. The alliance was transactional, built on the hard reality that the Kurds had no friends but the mountains. Israel was about to prove that proverb wrong, at least for a time. As the truck cleared the final checkpoint and rolled into the territory controlled by the legendary Mustafa Barzani, Eitan checked his gear one last time. He was no longer Eitan. He was Dr. Aryan, a European medical specialist and humanitarian aid coordinator. The legend was set. The operation had begun. The camp was invisible from the air, tucked beneath overhanging cliffs and camouflaged by the natural palette of the Zagros range. Life here was hard. The air was thin, and the amenities were non-existent, but the spirit of the rebellion was palpable. Eitan, now fully inhabiting the persona of Dr. Aryan, moved among the fighters with a calculated ease. He had spent years studying the culture, the language, and the tribal dynamics, understanding that in deep cover operations, the distinction between the operative and the cover had to blur until it vanished. Mustafa Barzani was a figure carved from the same granite as the mountains he defended. a leader who had returned from exile to professionalize the Kurdish resistance. He understood that courage alone would not defeat the tanks and aircraft of the Iraqi military. When Eitan first met him, the handshake was a secret treaty in itself, a Kurdish tribal leader shaking hands with the representative of a state that most of the region considered a pariah. "We need more than rifles," Barzani had told him during a late-night council, the kerosene lamp casting long shadows against the tent walls. "We need eyes. We need to know when the tanks start their engines in Baghdad, not just when they arrive at our valleys." This was the opening Eitan needed. "We can provide the eyes," Eitan replied, his voice steady. "We will train your men not just to fight, but to listen, to watch, and to report. We will build an intelligence network that spans from these peaks to the Tigris River." The training began immediately. Israeli advisors, arriving in small teams to avoid detection, set up specialized camps. They taught the Peshmerga the arts of modern guerrilla warfare, how to ambush armored columns, how to use the terrain to negate air superiority, and crucially, how to gather systematic intelligence. Eitan watched as young Kurdish scouts, who knew every goat path and hidden valley, were transformed into disciplined intelligence collectors. They were taught to identify unit insignias, to count logistical trucks to estimate troop strength, and to recognize the telltale signs of imminent offensives. But Eitan's true work was separate from the military advisors. He was constructing a legend that would allow him to move south. The Mossad had sent field hospitals to the region, and Israeli doctors were treating Kurdish civilians. This humanitarian cover was ironclad. Eitan began to travel from village to village, ostensibly assessing medical needs, but in reality, he was vetting routes and safe houses. The relationship between the Israelis and the Kurds deepened. They shared the same meager food, endured the same biting cold, and faced the same risks of Iraqi airstrikes. This shared hardship forged a bond that transcended the transactional nature of their alliance. The Israelis saw reflections of their own history in the Kurds, a people persecuted, fighting for self-determination against overwhelming odds. However, Eitan remained vigilant. He knew that this alliance was fragile, dependent on the whims of the Shah in Tehran and the silence of the international community. He used a radio transmitter concealed in a piece of medical equipment to send nightly reports to Tel Aviv. The messages were short, encrypted using one-time pads that made them mathematically unbreakable. "The foundation is laid," he tapped out one freezing night. "The gate is open. We are ready to push deeper." The deeper meant Baghdad. The Kurdish region was now a secure base of operations, a sovereign island within enemy territory. From here, Eitan would launch the next phase of Operation Aryan. He needed to infiltrate the Iraqi capital, not as a spy in the shadows, but as a man of influence. He needed to do what Wolfgang Lotz had done in Cairo, hide in plain sight, amidst the elite, sipping champagne while the world burned. The Kurds would be his transit, his support network, and his extraction plan. But once he crossed the line from the liberated north into the government-controlled south, he would be on his own. The transformation of Eitan into a high society figure required a legend as detailed and flawless as the one created for the Champagne spy years earlier. Mossad psychologists and planners had spent months crafting the backstory. Dr. Aryan was not just a physician, he was a specialist in tropical diseases and epidemiology, a field that gave him a plausible reason to travel, to inspect varied locations, and to interact with government officials concerned with public health. The backstory was meticulous. Born in Europe, educated in Switzerland, with a history of working in developing nations. Documents were forged, university transcripts, medical board certifications, and letters of recommendation from non-existent hospitals that had confirmed his employment if anyone checked. The key was to make him useful. In the 1960s, Iraq was modernizing, but its health infrastructure was still developing. A European specialist willing to work in the country was a valuable asset. Eitan spent weeks in the Kurdish mountains refining this persona. He practiced the mannerisms, the European accent, and the specific medical terminology required to pass scrutiny. He had to think like a doctor, not an intelligence officer. He carried a medical bag that contained legitimate instruments, but hidden within the lining were the tools of espionage, micro cameras, cipher pads, and the codes for emergency extraction. The plan was to enter government-controlled Iraq under the guise of a medical survey sanctioned by an international NGO that was, in reality, a Mossad front. The Kurds facilitated the first leg of the journey. Peshmerga guides led him through the no-man's land between the rebel-held territories and the Iraqi army lines. It was a harrowing journey through minefields and patrolled valleys, moving only at night. At the edge of the government-controlled zone, near the city of Mosul, the transition happened. Eitan said goodbye to his Kurdish protectors. He washed the mountain dust from his face, changed from rugged field clothes into a tailored European suit, and walked toward the Iraqi checkpoint. He was no longer the advisor in the tent. He was the arrogant, sophisticated European doctor annoyed by the delay. The Iraqi lieutenant at the checkpoint scrutinized his papers. The tension was absolute. One mistake, one slip in his accent, one document that didn't feel right, and it would be the end. Eitan channeled the confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. He complained about the heat, checked his watch, and spoke dismissively about the bureaucracy. "I'm expected at the Ministry of Health in Baghdad," Eitan said in heavily accented English. "Do you want to be the one to explain to the minister why his specialist is late?" The lieutenant hesitated, then handed the passport back. The psychological gamble had paid off. Eitan was through. He boarded a train bound for Baghdad, a method of travel that offered anonymity and predictable schedules, though he knew the risks of confined spaces. As the landscape shifted from the rugged mountains to the flat, arid plains of Mesopotamia, Eitan felt the weight of the operation settling on his shoulders. He was now in the den of the lion. Baghdad was a city of intrigue, paranoia, and power. The Ba'ath Party was consolidating its grip, and the security services were ruthless. Foreigners were watched, their movements tracked, their contacts noted. Eitan knew he had to build a life here that was so visible, so public, that no one would suspect the dark purpose beneath. He rented a villa in a fashionable district, distinct from the diplomatic quarter, but close enough to the centers of power. The doctor cover was active. Eitan began attending medical conferences, visiting hospitals, and most importantly, frequenting the social clubs where the Iraqi military and political elite gathered. He was the charming European doctor, a man of science who enjoyed the finer things in life, mirroring the strategy that had fooled the Egyptian elite years prior. He was waiting for the right patient, the right introduction, the single connection that would open the doors to the inner sanctum of the Iraqi regime. Baghdad in the late 1960s was a city of contrasts, ancient architecture clashing with modern ambitions, the call to prayer mingling with the rumors of coups and counter-coups. Eitan moved through this world like a ghost wrapped in a spotlight. His medical practice was legitimate enough to withstand scrutiny. He treated the children of wealthy merchants and the wives of civil servants, building a reputation for discretion and competence. But his eyes were always on the military. The primary objective of Operation Aryan, channeled through the Kurdish pipeline, was to assess the true capabilities of the Iraqi army and its Soviet backers. Israel knew that Iraq was receiving massive shipments of Soviet arms, tanks, artillery, and the crown jewel, the MiG-21. The Kurds had provided intelligence on the movement of these assets in the north, but Israel needed to know the strategic thinking in the south. Eitan frequented the Al-Mansour Club, a gathering place for army officers and high-ranking bureaucrats. He played the role of the neutral observer, the listener. He knew that a man who talks too much becomes a map others can read, so he became a shadow that people projected their egos onto. He bought drinks, listened to complaints about low pay and stalled promotions, and offered sympathetic nods to officers frustrated with the central command. It was at one of these evening gatherings that he met General Tariq. Tariq was a logistics officer, a man responsible for the movement of supplies to the northern front to fight the Kurds. He was tired, disillusioned, and fond of expensive scotch, which Eitan was happy to provide. "The mountains eat our men," Tariq complained one evening, his voice lowered. "We send division after division and they vanish. And now, the Russians want us to prepare for a war in the west against the Zionists, while we are bleeding in the north." Eitan poured him another glass. "It sounds like a difficult balancing act, General." "It is impossible," Tariq scoffed. "We are moving the new T-62 tanks to the western desert next month, but the crews, they are barely trained. They can drive them, yes, but fight in them. It will be a slaughter. This was gold. Eitan memorized the details, the type of tanks, the location of the deployment, the state of training. He didn't write anything down. That was amateur hour. He committed it to memory, to be encoded later in the safety of his villa. But crossing the line meant more than just listening. It meant active penetration. Eitan needed access to documents. He began to cultivate Tariq, inviting him to private dinners at the villa. He introduced the general to European culture, creating a safe space where the officer could relax and speak freely. Eitan played on the general's vanity and his grievances, careful never to ask a direct question that would trigger an alarm. One night, Tariq arrived with a briefcase. He was heading to a morning briefing and didn't want to leave the classified files at his office, which he felt was insecure due to internal rivalries. He trusted the good doctor's home more than his own headquarters, a testament to the psychological grooming Eitan had performed. While Tariq was distracted in the other room, perhaps enjoying the company of a guest Eitan had arranged, Eitan accessed the briefcase. He used a miniature camera, snapping pictures of deployment maps and supply manifests. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. If Tariq walked in, there would be no explanation, no escape. It would be the end of the road. He finished, closed the briefcase, and returned to his guest, his demeanor calm, his pulse slowing. He had crossed the line from passive observer to active spy. The intelligence he had just gathered would travel back up the chain, through the train to Mosul, across the minefields to the Peshmerga, and finally via encrypted radio to Tel Aviv. The Kurdish alliance was not just a distraction for Iraq. It was the conduit for its secrets. The success of a deep cover operative lies in their ability to be visible, yet unreadable. Eitan, as Dr. Aryan, had mastered the art of the cocktail circuit. In Baghdad, as in Cairo or Damascus, the elite moved in small, overlapping circles. Alcohol, though often prohibited religiously, flowed freely in these private gatherings, and guards were lowered. It was here, amidst the clinking of glasses and the haze of cigarette smoke, that the real business of the state was discussed. Eitan hosted lavish parties at his villa. He spent the operational funds Mossad provided on importing French cheese, good wine, and the latest music records from Europe. These events became the place to be for the mid-level and senior leadership of the Ba'ath Party. They came because Dr. Aryan was generous, he was foreign, and therefore outside the dangerous internal politics of Iraq. And he was an excellent listener. He adopted a persona that was sophisticated but approachable. He flirted harmlessly with the wives of generals, discussed art and history, and carefully steered conversations toward the one topic that consumed them all, the military situation. He learned to identify the different factions within the military, those loyal to the Soviet advisors and those who resented their influence. At one such party, the conversation turned to the Air Force. A young colonel, flushed with drink, began boasting about the new capabilities the Soviets were promising. "They say the new radar systems will make us invincible," the colonel bragged. "Even the phantoms won't be able to touch us." Another officer laughed. "If the equipment ever arrives, and if the Russians actually let us use the advanced modes, they treat us like children, giving us the monkey models while they keep the best for themselves." Eitan noted the term monkey models, export versions of Soviet equipment with downgraded systems. This was critical confirmation of what Western intelligence suspected but couldn't prove. The Soviets were selling their allies inferior technology to protect their secrets. Eitan's role required him to be a chameleon. He had to be sympathetic to the Arab nationalist cause in public while secretly working to dismantle it. He had to echo the anti-Israel rhetoric of his guests without overacting, nodding gravely when they spoke of driving the Zionists into the sea, all while calculating how to use their overconfidence against them. The psychological toll of this duality was immense. He was living in a state of constant cognitive dissonance. He could not speak his own language, could not acknowledge his heritage, and had to pretend to be friends with men who wished his people dead. The isolation was absolute. His only lifeline was the radio transmitter hidden in the hollowed-out leg of a heavy oak desk in his study. He sent weekly reports via the Kurdish relay. The intelligence was diverse. Details on the morale of the troops, the friction between Iraqi officers and Soviet advisors, and the economic strain the war in the north was placing on the regime. The Mossad analysts in Tel Aviv built a comprehensive picture of the Iraqi military machine, pixel by pixel, based on the whispers Eitan collected between toasts. But the cocktail circuit was not just about gathering information, it was about spotting vulnerabilities. Eitan was looking for the weak link, the person who was not just loose-lipped but turnable. He needed a source deeper than General Tariq, someone who could provide documents on the non-conventional weapons program Israel feared Iraq was developing. He needed a golden source. Identifying a potential recruit in a hostile capital is a delicate dance of psychology and observation. You don't look for the fanatic, you look for the cracks in the armor. You look for the man who has been passed over for promotion, the one with financial troubles, or the idealist who has become disillusioned. Eitan found his target in Dr. Hamid, a civilian scientist working within the Ministry of Defense's research division. Hamid was a quiet, intense man who attended Eitan's parties but rarely drank. He stood on the periphery, watching the generals with a mix of disdain and fear. Eitan approached him slowly over the course of months. They bonded over their shared profession of science. Hamid was a chemist, frustrated by the bureaucracy and the corruption that plagued his department. Science requires truth, Hamid murmured one evening in the garden, away from the noise of the party. But here, we are asked to fabricate results to please the leadership. We are building castles on sand. Eitan sensed the opening. He began to meet Hamid for lunch, discussing theoretical problems. Slowly, he peeled back the layers of Hamid's dissatisfaction. Hamid revealed that he was working on a project to develop chemical warheads for artillery shells, weapons intended for use against the Kurdish rebels in the mountains. This was a red line. If Iraq used chemical weapons in the north, it was a tragedy. If they perfected the delivery systems and turned them west toward Israel, it was an existential threat. Eitan knew he had to recruit Hamid. He didn't use money or ideology at first. He used the honey trap of intellectual validation and friendship. He made Hamid feel understood, respected, and valued in a way his own government did not. When the time was right, Eitan introduced the idea of international safety. "There are people who would want to know about these dangers," Eitan said carefully. "People who could help ensure these weapons are never used." Hamid looked at him, fear and realization warring in his eyes. "You are not just a doctor, are you?" "I am a man who wants to prevent a catastrophe," Eitan replied, holding his gaze. "And I can help you and your family get out of this madness. But first, we need to stop the program." Hamid eventually agreed, driven by a moral objection to the weapons he was building and the promise of a new life in the West. He became the golden source. He began to smuggle out technical schematics of the chemical plants and the weapon designs. Eitan processed this intelligence with extreme care. He couldn't risk carrying bulk documents. He used microdots and encrypted summaries. The flow of information went north. The Kurds, unknowingly, were transporting the blueprints of their own potential destruction out of the country to be analyzed by Western experts. The stakes had risen. Eitan was no longer just reporting on troop movements. He was handling a high-level asset in the heart of the enemy capital. The pressure was suffocating. Every knock at the door, every strange click on the telephone line, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. He knew that in the world of intelligence, perfection is required every single day, while the counterintelligence services only need to get lucky once. Communication is the Achilles heel of any deep cover operation. You can have the best cover and the best sources, but if you can't get the information out, it's useless. If you get caught transmitting, you're dead. Eitan relied on a hybrid system that utilized the unique geography of the Kurdish alliance. For high-priority, time-sensitive intelligence, like the imminent movement of chemical stockpiles, he used the radio transmitter, but he never transmitted from the same location twice if he could help it. He built the transmitter into a portable lantern, a device that looked innocuous but contained a powerful shortwave set in its base. He would drive out to the desert edge of Baghdad, claiming to be stargazing or hunting, and send bursts of encrypted data. These transmissions lasted seconds, squirts of data that were difficult for direction-finding equipment to triangulate. For bulkier intelligence, Documents, photos, physical samples, he used the Iron Road. This was a courier network he had established. He would leave packages at a dead drop, a hollow tree in a park, a loose brick in an alley, or a locker in the train station. A courier, usually a Kurd living in Baghdad who believed he was working for the Peshmerga leadership, would retrieve the package. The package would travel by train to Mosul, then by truck to the foothills, and finally by mule or foot into the mountains. There, Israeli intelligence officers stationed with Barzani would receive the materials. They would analyze them, prioritize them, and fly them out of the improvised airstrips in the mountains to Iran and then to Tel Aviv. This chain was long and vulnerable. Eitan worried constantly about a courier being intercepted. If the Iraqi Mukhabarat, secret police, caught a courier and broke him, the trail would lead back to the European doctor. To mitigate this, Eitan used cutouts. He never met the couriers. He used signals, a chalk mark on a lamppost, a specific flower pot in a window, to indicate that a drop was made or retrieved. He operated in a world of silence and symbols. The stress manifested in physical ways. He slept poorly, grinding his teeth. He drank more than he should at the parties to calm his nerves, balancing on the razor's edge of maintaining his cover while suppressing his terror. He knew that the Iraqi counterintelligence services were getting better. They were being trained by the East Germans and the KGB, experts in hunting spies. They were monitoring radio frequencies and tightening travel restrictions to the north. One evening, while listening to the static on his receiver, Eitan heard a specific pattern of clicks. A warning signal from Tel Aviv. Storm approaching. It meant that there was chatter in the Iraqi security services about a leak. They didn't know who, but they knew someone was talking. The net was being cast. By the early 1970s, the atmosphere in Baghdad had shifted from suspicion to paranoia. Saddam Hussein was rising to power, and his obsession with security was absolute. The doctor was still a popular figure, but Eitan felt the eyes on him. He noticed surveillance teams, men in unmarked cars parked down the street, reading newspapers for too long. Hamid, the golden source, was unraveling. The pressure of living a double life was destroying him. He began to call Eitan at his home, violating protocol. "They are asking questions," Hamid whispered into the phone one night. "They are auditing the research logs. They know pages are missing." Eitan had to calm him down, meeting him in crowded marketplaces where the noise would mask their conversation. "You must stay calm," Eitan urged. "If you run now, they will know. We need a little more time to arrange your extraction." But time was running out. The Iraqis had begun to execute suspected spies. Bodies were appearing in the streets as messages to others. The Kurdish war in the north was intensifying. The Shah of Iran was increasing his support, and the Israelis were sending more advisors than ever, hoping to break the Iraqi army's will. Eitan received orders to prepare for the final phase. He was to gather everything he could on the nuclear research program that Iraq was beginning to explore, a precursor to the Osirak reactor. This was the crown jewel of intelligence. He pressed Hamid for one last access. Hamid was terrified, but agreed. He managed to copy a set of files related to the procurement of nuclear technology from Europe. He passed them to Eitan during a brief brush pass in a cinema. That night, Eitan prepared the transmission. He knew it was risky. The Mukhabarat vans were patrolling the neighborhood, scanning for radio frequencies. He waited until 3 a.m. He set up the lantern transmitter, keyed in the code, and sent the burst. As soon as he finished, he saw headlights sweep across his window. A car had pulled up outside. His heart stopped. Had they triangulated him? He quickly disassembled the transmitter, hiding the components in a hollowed-out section of the floorboards under a rug. He went to the door in his robe, acting the part of the sleepy, confused doctor. It was a patrol, but they weren't there for him yet. They were arresting a neighbor, a general accused of plotting a coup. Eitan watched as the man was dragged away. It was a reprieve, but a warning. The trap was tightening. He needed to get out, and he needed to get Hamid out. Then came the betrayal that no one saw coming, or perhaps the one everyone ignored until it was too late. In March 1975, the geopolitical chessboard was upended. The Shah of Iran and Saddam Hussein met in Algiers and signed an agreement settling their border disputes. In a single stroke of a pen, the Kurdish rebellion was sacrificed. The Shah agreed to close the border and cease all support for the Kurds. The Americans, led by Henry Kissinger, acquiesced, famously stating that covert action should not be confused with missionary work. For the Kurds, it was a catastrophe. For Eitan and the Mossad agents in the mountains, it was a tactical nightmare. The supply lines were cut instantly. The Iron Road was closed. The Israeli advisors in the north were ordered to evacuate immediately before the Iranian border sealed shut. In Baghdad, Eitan received the news via a frantic, high-priority signal. Abort! Evacuate! The north is collapsing. He sat in his study, the blood draining from his face. The route north, his escape route, and Hamid's escape route, was about to become a war zone. The Iraqi army, freed from the threat of Iranian intervention, was launching a massive offensive to crush the Peshmerga once and for all. Eitan couldn't just leave. He had Hamid. He had the doctor legend to dismantle. If he fled, it would confirm he was a spy, and the Mukhabarat would tear apart everyone he had ever known to find his network. But staying was suicide. With the Kurds defeated, the Iraqis would turn their internal security apparatus inward with renewed ferocity. He made a decision. He would not leave Hamid behind. The promise of the Mossad, even in the cynical world of intelligence, had to mean something. He contacted Hamid. "We are leaving. Tonight." "The north?" Hamid asked, his voice trembling. "It's the only way," Eitan lied. He didn't tell him the north was falling. He just said it was time. The journey north was a descent into chaos. Eitan and Hamid, traveling in Eitan's Mercedes, drove toward Mosul. The road was clogged with military convoys heading north to finish the Kurds. Eitan used his medical credentials to pass checkpoints, claiming he was volunteering to treat civilian casualties in the combat zone. When they reached the edge of the Kurdish territory, the scene was apocalyptic. Villages were burning. Artillery pounded the hillsides. The Peshmerga, running low on ammunition and morale, were retreating. Thousands of refugees were streaming toward the Iranian border, hoping to cross before it closed. Eitan abandoned the car. They met with a contact, a Kurdish scout he had known from the early days. The scout looked broken. "They sold us," the Kurd said, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "The world sold us." "I know," Eitan said, feeling the weight of the betrayal. Israel had protested, but they couldn't stop the Shah. "But I need to get this man to the border. Can you help us?" The scout looked at Hamid, then at Eitan. "For you, doctor, because you were here when the snow was deep." They joined the column of refugees. It was a grueling trek through the high passes. The Iraqi Air Force was bombing the columns. Eitan and Hamid scrambled over rocks, hiding in caves when the jets screamed overhead. The doctor suit was ruined, replaced by local garb. Eitan was no longer the sophisticate. He was just another desperate soul in the mountains. They reached the Iranian border crossing at Hajj Omran, just as the final window was closing. The Iranian guards were turning people back, but Mossad had a liaison officer on the other side, working frantically to get their people out. The crowd was a crushing mass of humanity. Panic, screaming children, animals, and fighters dropping their weapons. Eitan spotted the signal, a piece of orange cloth tied to a jeep on the Iranian side. He pushed through the crowd, dragging Hamid. "Make way! Medical emergency!" he shouted in Kurdish. They reached the barrier. An Iranian officer blocked them. "Closed! Go back!" Eitan stepped close, speaking Farsi, a language he wasn't supposed to know. He gave a code phrase used by the intelligence services. "The orchid is wilting." The officer paused. He looked at a list. He looked at Eitan's desperate face. Then he looked at the Israeli liaison standing by the jeep, who gave a subtle nod. The barrier lifted just enough for 2 men. Eitan shoved Hamid through. "Go!" "And you?" Hamid asked, looking back. "I'm right behind you." As they crossed onto Iranian soil, the sound of Iraqi artillery grew closer. They were safe. But behind them, the gates slammed shut. The Kurdish rebellion was over for now. Barzani went into exile. The mountains were silent again, save for the wind and the explosions. Tel Aviv, 1976. Eitan sat in a cafe by the beach. The sun was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the Zagros. Hamid was safe. living under a new identity in Europe, working in a university. The intelligence he provided had set back Iraq's chemical program by years, but the victory felt hollow. Eitan thought of the Kurdish scout, of the villages, of the people who had trusted them. The periphery strategy had worked for Israel. It had kept Iraq occupied for a decade. But the cost was paid in Kurdish blood. The operation was officially a success. The deepest infiltration had yielded gold. But Eitan knew the truth that Henry Kissinger and the Shah had demonstrated so brutally. In the game of nations, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. The alliance with the Kurds would go dormant, only to be revived decades later when the wheel of history turned again. But for Eitan, the doctor was dead, left behind in the ruins of a villa in Baghdad. He was just a spy again, drinking coffee, watching the waves, and remembering the mountains that were the only friends the Kurds ever really had. The files on Operation Aryan were closed, stamped top secret, and archived. But in the shadows of the intelligence world, the lesson remained. You can build a perfect cover, infiltrate the deepest sanctums, and steal the greatest secrets. But eventually, you have to find a way home. And sometimes, the price of the ticket is betrayal. End of story. If this story of espionage, betrayal, and the cost of survival kept you on the edge of your seat, please like this video and share it. It helps us uncover more of these buried histories. And tell me in the comments, do you think the intelligence gained was worth the cost of the betrayal? Let's debate. See you in the next operation.